Hi, this is Paul. I promised a commentary video on this video, and I haven't made one yet. And the way I go, if I don't make it soon, it'll never get made. And my wife had a meeting tonight, so I thought I'd zip on over to the office and maybe do a little commenting on this, because I think this is actually quite an important video. So here we go.
The confusion, and there seems to be a good deal of it these days, is among American Jews who think that by submitting to ever-changing loyalty tests, they can somehow maintain the old status quo and their place inside of it. I share that first, not merely because it is, as we have come to expect from Barry, both insightful and incisive in terms of its ideas, but also beautiful and careful writing. But also because you might imagine, if you had fallen prey to the modern ideology, that someone like Barry, who was raised not particularly secularly, right? That she is Jewish and she is proud of her Judaism, and Rod Dreher, who is unapologetically Christian, and indeed the subtitle of his book, "Live Not by Lies," is a manual for Christian dissidents. That Barry and Rod might not have much in common, but of course they do and we do. Dreher has...
So a couple of things. First, the last video I made about Gnostic morality, let's call it. Morality within the system. I'm rereading C.S. Lewis's Miracles right now. I haven't read that book for a couple of years, which is unusual because I've been reading that book quite a bit over the last 10 years. But C.S. Lewis's Miracles continues to reinforce the fact that basically the way morality works, as we all act as if it works, is that there's some standard outside the system. I prefer that phrasing to it being objective. And I don't want to quibble with the word objective too much, except I think the word objective sort of places it in a particular frame. That's the word that Lewis uses. But basically that morality is something outside the system. And first, Bret and Heather are commenting on Barry Weiss's "Stopped Being Shocked." And the last comment she made was that basically Jews are making a calculation, and not just Jews. I think generally speaking, many people in America that are part of a certain class, have a certain education, they're all sort of looking at each other and getting signals about what is right and good to do. And I've seen that very interestingly enough, especially amongst denominational officials, elected officials. And part of this signaling, and sometimes it's called virtue signaling, but what it really is, if you remember in my last few videos, I talked about the fact that one way to understand human beings are that we are sort of like mockingbirds. We hear signals from trusted groups, and we present our allyship. So we mouth the talking points. This is sometimes seen as being a non-player character, and so I look around at who's my tribe, and they're all saying this thing, so I start saying this thing, and a lot of what we've been seeing in the culture has been exactly that. And so a lot of this talk, both sides, and this is, we need words to say. And I remember one of the guys in my meetup very quickly said of Jordan Peterson when we started meeting, he gave us words to say to situations that we felt were wrong but really didn't know what to say. And so basically Barry Weiss is saying that a lot of people in the Jewish community are doing this. They're being mockingbirds. All of their allies are saying the same thing, so they keep saying that same thing. And the insinuation is a little cynically, but I don't think unfairly, that, well, this is what we do in order to maintain our status and our position in the community. And this happens in church communities. I just did an interview for Nuance Forum in Nashville, and my friend Rod, not Rod Dreher, but a different Rod, recorded it, and we'll put it on their channel. And I asked if I could put it on my channel because I thought the conversation went well. But this is what happens in churches. So we get taught that to be a good Christian means to say the same things as all the other Christians are saying. And in fact, I was thinking about making a video about basically the phalanx, because not just Christians and churches do this, but all tribes and groups do this. You sort of present a phalanx, and you want to hold the line, and all the way up until really the American Civil War, when fighting shoulder to shoulder in a line became really crazy. That was how you would win wars, is you trained people that would be loyal to one another and loyal to their cause, so that they could stand shoulder to shoulder and the line would not break. And if they stayed together, well, then they would win the battle. Now, what's happening is that's sort of how we do tribal warfare with respect to ideas. And so, as Barry Weiss is saying, people are just sort of hearing, okay, we've been making anti-racism comments since the 1950s and 60s, and anti-racism, that phalanx so won the day that everybody was making anti-racism noises and anti-racism statements and anti-racism, they'd be reliable anti-racism allies, and so you just keep saying it. But then, of course, some people like Bret and Heather, the IDW, began to say, wait a minute, are we actually thinking about the words that are coming out of our mouth? And here Barry Weiss is saying that there's actually sort of a deceptive language has gotten into the line, and if you keep saying this thing, it will be your undoing. I have a friend who was talking to me about the practice in Canada of I hadn't really seen this. Apparently it happens in the States sometimes, but it's more prevalent in Canada. I went to a church meeting in Canada, and the director of the Christian Reformed denomination in Canada stood up and acknowledged the land that this we were in the United States at that point, but the land that this place was on was stolen from a particular group of indigenous people. And this person in Canada suggested to me that at some point, the historical remnants of these people might say, it's been in the town minutes forever that this land was stolen from us. They've just basically acknowledged and admitted it's stolen. Give it back. It's a very reasonable suggestion. And so in that way, if you sort of infiltrate the mockingbird, if you infiltrate the pattern repeater element that human beings are and sort of bypass the rational thought and get everybody saying the right thing, well, it just repeats and repeats and repeats. And of course, you'll engage all the allies, and you'll stimulate all the rivals, and just do this. Well, what if what you're saying is either not true or not in your self-interest, or it's basically a way to colonize you by putting words in your mouth? And of course, this has been a charge made against educating Christians when they're young, and all sorts of things. And so Barry Weiss is saying, yeah, you're saying these things, and you're gonna regret it sometime. You're not going to be able to maintain your status and your position in society by saying these things. It's a trick. You're being fooled. You'd better stop. And I'm forgetting some of the other things that Heather said. I'll go back.
Refer purely secularly, right? That she is Jewish and she is proud of her Judaism. And Rod Dreher, who is
so now she's pointing out the secular religious divide against this is religion S from a secular point of view, that Barry Weiss went to temple and was taught things about God and went through various ceremonies, and maybe even had a belief, and we'll duck into this modernist clothing, belief in the supernatural, yada, yada, yada. And Dreher certainly does.
Unapologetically Christian, and indeed the subtitle of his book, Live Not by Lies, is a manual for Christian dissidents. That Barry and Rod might not have much in common, but of course they do, and we do.
And this is the point that we've been making, that there's a deep formation that has come to many of us culturally. And this is in some ways Tom Holland's point, that culturally we have been formed by these narratives. To whatever degree we acknowledge some of the elements to it, there's some deep formation that has occurred.
And Dreer has referred to not just the two of us, Bret, but also Barry Weiss and James Lindsay, as the secular liberals with whom he finds himself in allyship. And this is
Okay, so now we're doing the phalanx thing, but we've got, some of these IDW people. And so how weird it is to have Barry Weiss and Rod Dreer and Bret Weinstein and Heather Hying and James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, all sort of on the same side. Now we're making a phalanx in order to resist the others.
is a kind of allyship that is honorable and real and important,
It's our allyship.
particularly right now.
So I want to place this in a little bit of context, maybe
Yeah.
a couple different kinds of context. First of all, I should say the essay is excellent and well worth a complete read. It is very much from a Jewish perspective.
Now some people knock Bret's comment there in the comment section. I think it's fair. I mean, to me, the question about standpoint epistemology is a very real thing. Now, the question is it, where should it be in terms of the hierarchy? Everybody has a point of view. Everybody has a point of view by their formation. To what degree does that point of view simply obliterate every other aspect of a person? I think that's where the standpoint epistemology of this particular tribe really goes wrong. It's a gross overselling. And so if you listen to, okay, you got Barry Weiss and you got Rod Dreer and you got James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian and Bret Weinstein and Heather Hying, they're all sharing a similar standpoint, even though there are plenty of other subtle, smaller standpoints. Within this perspective, they all are seeing from the same point of view.
And I want to point out why this is so resonant.
Yeah.
So Barry's thesis in her most recent book is effectively that when the center doesn't hold, it collapses on Jews.
That's a very broad statement. Now, given the amount of brutality, anti-Semitic brutality throughout history, it's not an unreasonable statement. But when the center, which center? I haven't read the book. Maybe she goes into explains it. But the point that Bret is making is not dissimilar to a point that I've made often, which is that part of the reason I think this new ascendant morality is dangerous is because I think in the long run, it will most hurt those it purports to protect. What happens when, well, everybody keeps saying that white people will lose their majority status in the United States. What happens when white people start acting like an ethnic tribe? I think that's a very bad thing. And I think that will be a very bad thing for all of the other ethnic tribes. And, I think Jordan Peterson made the point well. This is a bad game to play because, first of all, it simply isn't true. All white people think the same. Oh, all black people think the same. Oh, I mean, it's just, if you live in any community long enough, you begin to recognize that there are diversities of beliefs within community. There's diversity of beliefs within a family. There's diversity of beliefs within a marriage. That's part of what makes the conversation here interesting.
That this is the explanation for many of the atrocities that history has seen. And so in effect,
Well, the question would be, why do they collapse on the Jews? In the previous video, I noted that Nazism had a particular line of thought with respect to the Jews, and it's a very interesting one. Very wrong, it's very immoral, it's very racist, but they basically said that, well, the Jews are responsible for all of this culture net thinking up here, and what we really have to do is get rid of that so that their late 19th century social Darwinian ideas, which you can still go into the Museum of Man in San Diego in Balboa Park and look at all of these little heads, and people are like, well, here we can see all of the human races and their genetic ancestry, and for the most part that's been debunked by the actual study of genetics. But what about the Jews? What about their culture net aspects? What's really going on with this persistent pattern in history?
Is raising the alarm that the center is collapsing. And we can talk, and we have talked over the last 50 episodes and elsewhere about why the center is collapsing. In effect, it is being punished out of existence by fringes on both sides. But nonetheless, the recognition that there is
Well, and I think a number of my recent videos, I don't think they've done enough thinking about what about Western liberalism is going away and why. And if they thought more deeply about it, it doesn't mean we should abandon what's good about Western liberalism. It simply means we should recognize its shortcomings and address them.
a kind of paralysis, which I must say I am seeing also in many of the sort of private discussions that we are party to these days, where there's so much to be seen in the breaking apart of this agreement in the center. And I don't mean centrism, but this agreement about the basic principles that we should collectively defend. That there is a temptation to simply catalog and marvel and gawk at all of the various examples of things going wrong, rather than to...
And I think that's a great point. And I think a lot of the traffic on Twitter and talk, and I'm probably guilty of this too. It's just been a little shocking that some of this stuff seems so outlandish. But he's right that there's a deeper analysis that needs to be had.
Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. People do extrapolate to what this means about where we are headed collectively, but there is no agreement about what the details of that are liable to look like and what we ought to do about it. So we see people fleeing cities, for example, but there's no consensus about how much of this remains abstract, how much this could turn into, an atrocity on our own shores.
And this is part of why I find, that we are going to talk about three of the things that I pulled from Dreer's book that we have talked about separately, but that he really puts front and center, that are ways that those of us who are maybe dissident Christians or Jews watching the center collapse, or secular liberals, or some combination of those, or outside of any of those groups, and yet watching this what Dreer calls a soft totalitarianism or a therapeutic totalitarianism, that we need to return to some principles that we will talk about here of the value of family, the value of privacy, and the value of community. And how is it that we can actually recover and reinvigorate our own selves above and beyond the level of the individual, to return ourselves to family, privacy, and community.
Family is a very interesting one in this mix because, again, I obviously agree with them, myself being a Christian, but we'll get into that.
Right. And so the orientation to those things, which strike people in some ways as conservative, is also an indicator of the reason for the alliance, which I think once you spot it is is very intuitive,
right, between,
for example, Christians and Jews. Mm-hmm. Now, I hope we will not forget at some point to take the visible alliance that is emerging here, if it's even an alliance, if that's even the right terminology for it, and place it in an evolutionary context. Because right, I do think there's something important to be said about whether or not, obviously Jews and Christians are distinct. On the other hand, Judeo-Christianity.
Now, that term Judeo-Christianity really got going in the United States during the Cold War. And Jordan Peterson has used it often. It's a cold warrior. I mean, it's something that we would hear from Dennis Prager. And of course, Dave Rubin has sort of become, really taken on a lot of that. And then so to have Bret Weinstein take this language up, to me, again, is very interesting. And now remember, this human repeater aspect of us that when we find ourselves in a phalanx, then we start taking on the language, and you see that happening in this video, and it just fascinates me.
Is something. And so putting that in evolutionary context probably makes a lot of sense.
Just at its most, at the simplest level, Christianity emerges from Judaism.
Right. And so, if you apply the tools of phylogenetic systematics in a place where admittedly not all of the assumptions are perfectly met, but they're met well enough that we can justify it at least at the level of a very strong analogy, it would be like a large clade of creatures emerging from a comparatively small clade of creatures, which of course is something that happened many times in history. So Christianity is in some sense a form of Judaism, and Protestantism is a form of Christianity, and so forth. But then there's also this other fact, which is that many of the belief structures that are innovated in Christianity have moved culturally into Judaism. And so
And again, I think he's dead on right here, and it's just fascinating listening to his description of this in biological terms.
in some sense, Christians are phylogenetically Jewish and Jews are mimetically Christians, which is, once you spot the implications of that, the whole thing makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and so the secular liberalism, so named by Dreher, which we will return to, is in some ways formalized. It's formalized across many faiths, but we in the West, I think, are most.
And again, this is Tom Holland's point, is that secularism is in fact sort of I call it kind of a secret sister of the church. It's sort of a weakened it's sort of a sneaky Christian idea that subtly colonizes people around the world. They won't go to church. They won't say, I believe in God the Father. They won't go through the Apostles' Creed. They won't practice. They won't do all of this religion-esque stuff. But secularism reshapes the world and in some ways conquers the world nearly completely, with the exception right now of really some Islamic states. And now we're beginning to see, Turkey sort of reverting back and India sort of reverting back. And again, recognizing the deeply Protestant, in many ways, just as, boy, this is going to get me in trouble. And in many ways, just as Protestantism is phylogenetically, from the Christian tree, a lot of the other Christian branches, the Roman Catholicism, and I think probably the longer the Orthodox remain in the States, they're going to be mimetically Protestant. And that's just sort of how we work. So, yeah, I know some of you are not going to like what I just said, but I think it's true.
Most familiar with it in Christianity, and it has become all of our birthrights. Right? It is as Barry Weiss writes in the essay from which I read, and as Dreher writes in this book, something that we are all born to, and most of us, I think, have expected would continue. And so, Dreher is sounding the alarm, saying people who actually lived under totalitarian regimes, which is, to say in Eastern Europe mostly not very long ago, are seeing what is happening in the West right now and saying, no, this doesn't look exactly like history, but yes, there are too many things that are familiar, such that anyone who is not concerned right now is blind either willfully or not. So I think it does warrant saying as well, since we're talking about the sort of phylogenetic relationship between Christianity and Judaism and the cultural, effectively the cultural borrowing of some of the so-called liberal ideals from the teachings of Jesus by the vast majority of people who call themselves secular liberals, which includes.
Did you hear that? That's astounding. I mean, she basically articulated. I mean, just a year ago, we were listening to Jordan Peterson and Steven Pinker and Jordan Peterson and others basically saying Western liberalism is the heir of historic Christianity all the way to Jesus, and Steven Pinker and many others are no, that's the Enlightenment clean room that came up with all of these ideas. Now, again, I've been reading some 18th century history, and if you look at Voltaire and Rousseau and some of the philosophers, there are some elements in Western liberalism. To be fair to Steven Pinker, there's some elements in Western liberalism that that just 100 years before, many Protestants, well, even when Voltaire and Rousseau came out with them, religious toleration. So many of these ideas were fringe in the 18th century among many Protestants. I mean, Rousseau was having a hard time finding a place to live because, well, partly he's just such a everyone would say whoever harbored Rousseau was just causing problems on themselves, and it just proved right again and again. Hume brought him to England, and that was a mess, and so you just didn't want to play host to Rousseau because he and his mistress, it was just going to be a mess. The guy just made messes all over the place. But these people were hated by everyone. Voltaire played a little bit nicer, and so was able to hang with was able to find spaces to hang with royalty and with Calvinist pastors and all of that. But in all fairness to the Enlightenment, they did change the format and did win the day. And some would argue that, well, that's basically just another evolution and development of Protestantism. And eventually, Roman Catholicism in the United States and around the world would accommodate to it, and we'll see the degree to which the Orthodox Church makes similar accommodations. So there's a lot going back and forth, but basically here Heather Heying just basically admits it. This is, liberalism derives many of its ideas from Jesus, and I think that's correct. Jesus did not attempt to install what we would categorize, looking at Islamic states, as a theocratic regime. Jesus did not, and part of the reason he was crucified was he did not war against the Romans the way many of the groups in the Jewish culture war wanted to get him out. And he both asked forgiveness for his Roman and Jewish executioners, and he welcomes a violent revolutionary who is being crucified at the same time he is in paradise that day, simply for asking. So Heather Heying, I think, is speaking the truth here, but it's pretty amazing that she's just laying it right out there. It's as if, Steven Pinker and that tribe just said, all right, we give. Liberalism is the heir of Christianity.
Of the so-called liberal ideals from the teachings of Jesus by the vast majority of people who call themselves secular liberals, which includes, I think, a majority of Jews, at least in America, that you and I, to some degree, come from these two different traditions as well. All right, that maybe you can speak in a couple of sentences about the home that you were raised in, but I was raised mostly without religion, but
Religion S.
My father was a lapsed Catholic who, not as it turns out on his deathbed, but at one point when we thought he might not come out of open heart surgery, did ask actually to see a priest and talk to him, which as far as we know, he hadn't done for decades. And so a man of
speaking as a Christian minister, not unusual.
Science, a man of reason, a man who prized Enlightenment values, was in some ways a man of faith as well. And although he took me into a church, I believe once and only once, to see the midnight mass one Christmas Eve, and so never took to me the faith that he was raised with on a on a farm in northeastern Iowa in the 40s and 50s. It was part of how he was how he informed his own view, and my mother also emerges from a Christian tradition, although had no was not raised with any faith herself, and they did not raise me with any.
And again, what she means by faith is all of these things about a God and prayer and practices and rituals and propositional beliefs, yada, yada, yada.
And
So for my part, I was raised in a home that was decidedly secular. Both my parents are Jewish, but it was...
And again, we assume he means they didn't go to temple, they didn't do any of those things. But again, notice the sort of segmentation in that, as I said in the previous video, we as infants and then small children were these little sponges. We absorb these first drafts, and these first drafts from our parents are massive. We couldn't begin to sit down and all write them out, and we can only over time and real work articulate them into things like propositions, but we absorb them anyway, and they get passed down generation to generation.
You know, there was ceremonial observance, but nothing based on faith, I would say.
That's an interesting. So why this ceremony? Well, what do you mean by faith? Well, faith is that, and I would imagine he would argue that, relating to the super thing, that the super thing would do things for you or move things in history, that prayer could somehow be effective, et cetera, et cetera.
And that went back, a couple generations on my mom's side. But my best friend growing up actually was in a Jewish home that was observant and kept kosher and I think believing. And so anyway, I got exposure to it that way among...
And again, believing. Well, what do you mean by believing? Well, believing that prayers to God would be effective and God would look out for their people. And even when things in history weren't going their way, that it was part of a bigger plan and that in the end, things would... Now, again, I'm speaking from a Protestant perspective. We talked to Jacob in the Discord server, and he might be able to correct some of this. But basically, that engagement with the God would be something of consequence in terms of something of, and now I'm trying to work my way around the word supernatural, something of consequence that if they were not doing so, world history in the future, or the world events in the future would be different. Let's say it that way.
Others. So anyway, I think...
Actually, before you go
Sure.
on, there's so many places that we could go today, and there's a lot that I do want to get to, and we may just end up going longer than we normally do. But one of the things I started doing in thinking about this book and Barry's essay, and really everything that's going on in the world for, depending on how you count, decades now, was how is it that people end up resisting the ideology, what many of us are seeing as a creeping totalitarian.
That's a very good question. And I think there's a lot of answers.
And
I just mentioned Nuance Forum. They did an interview on Nuance Forum. They haven't done a lot of these public things, but they did one with Chris Arnade. And Chris Arnade, in the process of that conversation, said something very interesting, which I think was very right. He said, it's not really too hard to make a dissident. He said, make someone who is racist. It's give someone the chance that a system is being unfair. Now, there's a lot that goes into that unfair, but who would resist the current ascendant regime? Well, people who are looking around and saying, well, what's happening here is unjust.
And I was thinking, for instance, of myself, I don't remember how I ended up for.
Well, you two, they're going to talk, of course, Evergreen. Why? In my local meetup, when we talk about these two, the regular conversation is they set the table with the knives they would find in their back. And Fair or not fair, I don't know, but generally speaking, nuance that a professor has sometimes, especially when the students are listening to lots of other different voices around them, that nuance can be lost.
For instance, what many of us are seeing is a creeping totalitarianism. And I was thinking, for instance, of myself, I don't remember how I ended up, for instance, in a class on Solzhenitsyn and Kundera my first quarter in college as a literature major, but how lovely for me that I did.
Christians would talk about providence, but go on.
And then that I pursued the writings of Jorge Luis Borges, who, very different kind of guy, but, also brought just ideas from a completely different world that was informed by different life experiences than anyone I had ever met. Similarly,
Well, that's also some of the globalism that these two were raised in and are a part of.
you can talk about, your best friend growing up having been being in quite a religious family. Many of my friends growing up were Jewish, as you know, and my mother's dearest friend and for a period business partner was Jewish as well. And the times that we had at her house, and the ability for me to learn from her mother, who had come over from Poland, actually, who had fled, to learn how to make latkes, for instance. I was sort of immersed in this stew of secular Judaism in a way, but then also surrounded by a tremendous number of gay men who were the artistic friends of my mother and her dearest friend during the emerging
So there's a context and a culture that she was raised in.
AIDS crisis, as they didn't know what was happening and they were watching their friends die. And so how do all of those different experiences inform a person such that they grow up and, as an ideology shows, and says, follow me, or you're a bad person? What is it? What all is it in a person's experiences that allow them to say, I'm not a bad person, and actually following you might send me down a path that could turn me into one?
Okay, remember the moral video I made? Okay, so how is morality known? Is it sort of reckoning within? But now when we've got this good person, bad person, which is sort of a judgment from outside the system.
So I want to connect a couple things up here.
Yeah.
One, there's something interesting in the fact that even now I couldn't tell you whether or not the family that I had so much contact with growing up had any faith in the supernatural. I
This is getting interesting.
assume there was some, but there is.
But they didn't talk about it, or he didn't ask, or what?
Something to be said for, on the Jewish side of the equation, it is very frequent for Jews to have a personal and, I think, complex relationship with the idea of faith that can go up through having no faith in the supernatural whatsoever and still being observant.
Yeah.
And so over time.
So now we're already starting to deconstruct the religion-esque thing. So there's faith in the supernatural. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that somehow relating to the God will be consequential in history, as if I don't relate to the God, and not just in terms of things here, but things from outside? Again, I'm rereading C.S. Lewis's Miracles, which is all about naturalism and what naturalism is. And so what Bret is sort of tiptoeing through here is very interesting in that part of the conversation.
I've come to understand, if we take Barry's perspective, for example, that the center has to hold in order for Jews to have a place in most societies.
Now, I'd really love to. Well, what do you mean by the center? That here that we have this position, which in some ways it's a framework in which religion is a particular thing, so you can opt out of it. And again, part of what is so scary as a Christian, as an observant Christian, as a supernaturalist Christian, is that this framework is built into the American legal system in a very deep way. and is currently being, and this is part of Rod Dreher's point. I mean, if there's anything you can get from his blog after reading it for the last 5 years, it's that not allowing communities to have ideas such as believing that same-sex relationships are not in alignment with God's will, to allow, let's say, Christian colleges to maintain that position and still participate in public things such as student aid, credentialing, these types of things. It's that sort of that religious cutout. And so the point is often made that during the Clinton administration, this religious liberty legislation that passed nearly unanimously, both Republicans and Democrats, as a short time ago as the Clinton administration, now is seen as something morally, again, there's that word again, abhorrent. So that is all in some ways based on freedom of religion. Assumes that religion is a thing that you can either opt into or opt out of, which, of course, if you go back to the 18th century when this stuff all came into the American system, well, that was the dominant framework that they were working from.
That there is an anti-fragility to Jews because, frankly, they've faced so many of these different catastrophes. And I would say, as an evolutionary biologist, it's a little bit surprising that we haven't gone extinct.
You might just imagine that God, number one, number two, had chosen them.
Right, and that it has to do with certain kinds of...
because, of course, where are the Babylonians? Well, there's their genetic heirs, but I go down the street and I can't find the first church of Marduk.
Wisdom about how to endure these things, often not very well, but simply to persist through an era in which the center has not held. And so one of the things, on the Christian side, it's very frequent that as people lose their faith, they also lose their tradition.
He's right. Partly because maybe their tradition is the whole country.
And so one of the things that I think maybe to be learned from the Jewish side is that there's a reason not to do that, even at the point that something challenges faith, that there is, it's Chesterton's fence all over the place. There are all of these protective traditions that may not be straightforward in the way that they protect. In other words, metaphorical truths may be offering some kind of immunity.
And we invoke in the book that we are writing, Chesterton's gods. Abandon them at your peril. How do you know what all they are doing for you? And, we say this is people without faith.
I just can't believe it. And so it's just see the past almost 4 hours of video, or maybe even more, that I made in anticipation of this. Chesterton's fence basically says that there's a purpose into it. Now, what's the framework that they're imagining here? I'm just astounded by what these two are saying right here.
Yep. I think we are seeing, and Dreher, is pointing to it, and Barry is in her own way pointing to it as well, that it is not at all surprising that, if it's on the Christian side, maybe it's almost exclusively people who have retained a kind of faith because they've also retained the traditions that has put a brake on runaway liberalism. And that doesn't mean ambitious liberalism. I think ambitious liberalism created the West, but runaway liberalism is very dangerous, and we've seen it drive societies into the ground before. So there's a question about whether that's where we're headed. But to see people come from religious traditions of different kinds and begin to sound the alarm from different places and create alliances is, it's at least hopeful.
Yeah, no, I think it is exactly that. And that's... that hope is part of why I wanted to start with Barry Weiss's essay before moving into a more extensive discussion of Dreher's book.
It might be expensive.
So I want to read just just a page really from the very beginning. And I am going to almost certainly butcher every name in here from Eastern Europe because I don't know.
Okay, there's a lot here, and you can obviously watch the whole video. It's way more people have watched that video than will ever watch this video. But I want to get into some of the points that Bret's going to make here.
To me in this moment, I hope this works, that the tell with respect to Antifa is that it is anarchist, right? There's nothing about anti-fascism in the literal sense that should travel with anarchism, right? In fact, I would argue this is in effect a non sequitur, right? And that, that anarchism has put on the cloak of anti-fascism in order that it can engage in destructive behavior and get away with it is not surprising, right? You need to have some sort of a defense. And in fact,
now I think a key is if you read something like Tim Snyder's Black Earth. Tim Snyder's Black Earth makes the assertion that Nazism was anti-state and attempted to destroy the state, sometimes using states, but attempted to destroy the state. Basically, Nazism was sort of an environmental anarchism because the idea, and in this sense, and that's for that reason that they, and as Jacob said in the Discord server, he said, it's unfair to recognize all of the Slavs and Roma and many, many people that the Nazis killed. They didn't just kill the Jews. They killed a lot of people. But the reason they killed the Jews, and this idea was broadly around in Eastern Europe at that point. I mean, Poland was also trying to deal before the war, before the Soviet Union and Germany both collapsed and ate Poland. Poland was considering, shipping out all the Jews to Madagascar. I mean, the Madagascar solution was a solution for the Jews. But the anarchism by Antifa is ironically very much in alignment with Nazi ideology, because the idea is that if you can get rid of states, well, then emergent naturalism will somehow rise up, and then you can have the competition of the races. And again, they're imagining that somehow Germans and Austrians are different races, or the Germanic people are, So again, they had this granular racism that the Nazis were working. But if you can get rid of, out of chaos will emerge. Now, what's interesting is that the Marxist used anarchy to different effects. It's important to recognize that anarchism was alive and well in the early 20th century in Europe. Serbian anarchists, unintentionally in some ways, launched the First World War. So this anarchism is sort of a way of getting rid of order, because they believe in a certain naturalism that other forces are going to somehow assert themselves then into peace. Now, in terms of some of the anarchism in America, this is just stupid, because again, if white America starts acting like a racial minority, the rest of the racial minorities need be afraid. And that's why I think this entire schema is a bad one. So, Bret's point here is right. And the irony is that Antifa, in many ways, is just ripping a part of their playbook from the Nazis.
Anarchism was a niche fringe idea that always lurked at some, tiny, insignificant level in the Pacific Northwest, and then it suddenly took up anti-racism and anti-fascism as those things became fashionable.
And I think if you go to the Distributists' video on New Atheism is boring, gets into this idea, which I think he correctly points out, this idea beneath, and this is part of problem with certain elements of liberalism that, in sort of a Rousseauian way, that if you get rid of the institutions, that people underneath are good and kind and moral and not racist at all. And I think that's simply not founded. I think that people very quickly, and Peterson would bring this out again and again, people, if you get rid of some of the institutions that are actually retarding racism now, people will, for lack of other structures, become very racial, very tribal, very pragmatic. And so the anarchism will actually prompt probably racial violence and get people to, now that you've been reinforcing racial thinking and racial essentialism in the culture, you're actually going to see more overt forms of racism, the kinds of which we haven't seen in America for 70 years.
Okay, it's obvious what the ploy is, and we have an obligation not to listen to it, right?
Yes, we do. Yes. Was that?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
effectively it.
Yeah, we into Dreer's framing of, I've already mentioned, a soft totalitarianism or also a therapeutic totalitarianism.
Now, this is something I'd like to see them go into because, of course, if you understand Dreer before Oberfeld, he would regularly go after moralistic therapeutic deism, which of course is the framework that was come up with by Christian Smith, is description of what religion had become in America. And Dreer's very crunchy religion very much has no room for, so his therapeutic totalitarianism. I wonder if Heather and Bret really have an understanding of where Dreer is coming from with respect to these ideas. Part of what's interesting here is that the therapeutic totalitarianism, which I think for Dreer is a very critical point, because Dreer imagines that the universe, the culture net of the universe, is deeply structured and is not simply an emanation of what's happened, but is in fact the universe is heading towards a conclusion, and the conclusion will be, depending on Dreer's eschatology, the conflict and triumph over all of that stuff in CultureNet, which is a consequence of his full-blown theism. And he sees the therapeutic as a real issue in that. Now, Heather and Bret, the therapeutic / soft totalitarian therapeutic drops out, and I think rightly so, because they're understanding soft totalitarianism in a degree of alignment with Dreer, but the therapeutic aspect I don't think they're going to see or really wrestle with, partly because that will be an element of fairly deep disagreement. In other words, these folks are allies of convenience, and this comes true fairly clearly right here in Bret's political thinking.
But I think you said governance
is that which governs.
Governance is that which governs, which seems both tautological and therefore hard to escape, as must be a definition that is at least true, even if it's not sufficient.
No, I would say, let's take the British monarchy.
Okay.
The British monarchy does not govern, right?
Mm-hmm.
It governs.
See, and the distinction now between the British monarchy and the type of power the British monarchy has. Again, the type of power the British monarchy has, which I would argue is religion worldview, religion W. And Bret will say, well, that's not really power. It's the other kind of, it's the hard kind of governance. And this is where it really gets interesting.
Governs in as much as it manages to fend off taxation and, demand a certain amount of infrastructure to keep the monuments alive. But it is
and again, the monuments alive. well, what are the monuments doing? How are the monuments governing? And again, go back to Stephen Smith. The symbols are in many ways what are creating what is creating all of the culture net up here, okay? All of the religion W. It's the symbols. And so if you want to see what's happening in a culture, watch the symbols. But for Bret, not so much.
Ceremonial apparatus, even though
again, it's sort of a dismissive of the symbolic, the ceremonial. Maybe if the royal family isn't determining tax policy, they're not governing, or maybe they're governing in a realm that Bret doesn't see very clearly. And this is especially interesting given the fact that he had just, I thought, made the incredibly important point about all of the symbolic ritualization as being the thing which has managed to keep the Jewish people alive, even if the rider in the elephant there, the Jewish rider in the elephant says, I don't believe in the supernatural, but the elephant continues to go through the rituals.
it looks like a governmental apparatus from centuries back, right? In this case, what you have is
This case being the United
the
States.
United States at the present. We know empirically that the public will does not have a strong influence. It has almost no influence, in fact, on policy, right? We fight over policy. We battle at the ballot box over policy, but then the policy manages not to serve any of us.
Now, this is fascinating, too, because this has been a Tea Party argument, which has, in fact, led to Donald Trump, that Republicans had gone to the polls and elected president after president, and abortion maintained itself and didn't get taken. Or the Democrats could say that we don't have single-payer health care, even though Barack Obama, yada, yada, yada. So what's interesting here is, okay, where is power? And so, again, they should definitely have Dreer on, and I would like to not just see a nice little cozy ally conversation between Dreer and these guys, but I'd like to see Dreer do his thing, because Dreer's program is very different from these two.
As it serves, or it accidentally serves us as it serves the interests of things that really do have influence.
Right.
And so,
really do have influence. The Queen has no influence. And again, I want to concede, I've talked to British friends of mine that sort of, roll their eyes at the monarchy, but suddenly during the pandemic, everybody thought that it was really important for the Queen to say something. What kind of power is that?
there's no clear line here. Does the government govern? Yes. In whose interest? Oh, those that corrupt it. So it's a puppet of something that governs, right? And that puppet thing is now going woke, right? So we are now seeing.
So where, if we were talking radio spectrum, on what wavelengths does that operate?
These sort of self-imposed sets of guidelines flowing through, corporate boards. And then we are seeing the government potentially being persuaded to institute, quotas and things like this and impose them on these corporations. And, most importantly, we see the corporations deciding the limits of actual speech. Can you still say anything you want? Sure.
And of course, after this, Bret would be kicked off of Facebook.
Confines of your own home. Can you say it where people are actually listening? Well, no. Twitter had, decided to shut down, Twitter and Facebook decided to shut down this expose of the Hunter Biden Ukraine business this week on the basis that it was somehow faulty or dangerous, which is preposterous. It was embarrassing to a political entity that Twitter and Facebook favor. So we are seeing, I guess the other way I would say it is that the founders, at the point that they were protecting our ability to gather and speak with each other and voice opinions that were not popular, were worried about the state itself. They didn't understand that something would evolve that would have power that would dwarf the state, that would take over the state, and therefore the protections are inadequate. And so anyway, ultimately, is there anything inherently soft about the totalitarianism that is moving? Is it early in the trajectory, and will we laugh at the term soft totalitarianism 5 years from now when we've seen where it actually goes?
Notice therapeutic has completely dropped out of the conversation, which, again, if you've read enough Dreer, I would argue for Dreer, the therapeutic totalitarianism is really the big thing. Okay, now Heather's going to get into the therapeutic aspect a little bit.
I mean, I don't think the term is meant to imply that it's nicer. It's just that it's not enforced with the backing of military. And like I just made that up at the moment, but it's different, and this is one way of describing the difference. And I do find that his characterization, Dreer's characterization of it as a therapeutic totalitarianism, is actually even more apt. So he says, I said already that he describes therapeutic totalitarianism as hatred of dissenters from this utopian ideology that comes in the guise of helping and healing, right? But he specifically argues that therapy, that the therapeutic mode is a sort of postmodern mode of existence, which I think is apt. Again, this is written as a book, quote unquote, for Christian dissidents. And so he talks about religious man giving way to psychological man. Religious man, in his definition, is living according to a belief in transcendent principles that order human life around communal purposes, right? And psychological man believes there's no transcendent order and life's purpose is to find one's way experimentally.
And where would these two be in that divide?
And there's a way in which, if you just took that out of context entirely and said, okay, psychological man, there's no transcendent order and life's purpose is to find one's way experimentally.
Isn't that what we were talking about in terms of how do you know morality? Well, either it's outside the system or we're just always dead reckoning from within the system trying to find what works.
That sounds a lot like something that we believe, that you and I believe, as people without faith and who do understand evolution to explain the current forms of life on Earth. However, the description of religious man, if you read it metaphorically, is also something that we hold very, very dear, which is that if I just take out transcendent for the moment, lives according to
Yeah.
belief in principles that order human life around communal purposes. That this is absolutely a huge value in human life, and it is a loss that we have seen. If I just take out transcendent for the moment, lives according to belief in principles that order human life around communal purposes.
Principles. Are they in the system? Are they outside the system?
That this is absolutely a huge value in human life, and it is a loss that we have seen as modernity has increasingly valued the individual and the individual's comfort and pleasure and thrills over anything that might in any way constrain those comforts and pleasures and thrills.
Now, if you go back again a few videos in terms of why I like these two, because what are they dividing here? They're in some ways collectivists. Okay, these two went and taught at a small college because even knowing they wouldn't get a Nobel Prize or they wouldn't make money, and they would sacrifice for the group. So these two are collectivists, all right, and so that's very fair here, but okay, collectivism based on what? A utopian vision? And again, some of the people in my meetup group would be jumping up and down right now, and some of you are, because you're saying, well, these two are Marxists complaining about Marxism. And they said, no, we're not Marxist. What exactly are you?
Such as religion, okay, but also family, also community, also just anything that reveals that you are in fact answerable to a greater good that may be of your own choosing in your friend group, or
Greater good, your own choosing in your friend group.
Not as much of your own choosing in your family. And this is not to say that people don't sometimes, draw a terrible hand and are born into terrible families from which they must escape and therefore have no option to be part of a family that is wonderful and loving. But most of us aren't in that situation. And the
Who's us? This is just fascinating.
idea that we can, and indeed that we must, overthrow family as a constraint, that it is from the past and we are interested only in moving forward and finding new ways that are filled with rainbows and unicorns in this utopian future, well, it's not just delusional, but it's dangerous. So
I listen to that. I'm really trying to be fair at coherence here, but I don't know. I don't know. I don't know where she's getting these ideas beyond that. She grew up in a reasonably good family, and from everything we're able to see about Bret and Heather, they're wonderful parents. They have a wonderful marriage. They're raising wonderful children. The destruction of the family has, again, if you read Yuval Harari's book on Sapiens, I mean, basically the idea is that family can be jettisoned because of market and state, and market and state can now replace family, and you have the individual, and these two are pushing back on the individual. Is it romanticism? I'm just not sure.
and we're still. Let me just share a little bit more before you riff again, because we've gotten through very little of this so far. In communist
It's a big subject.
Russia, Dreer reports, parents were choosing to avoid what he calls contamination of the humanities by encouraging children to study natural sciences. This sounds a little bit like what is going on with critical race theory and intersectionality in the modern academy, except, of course, in modernity, in modern times, we have this ideology has marched right into the natural sciences, has declared that male and female are social constructs and don't really differ at all, and even the natural sciences aren't safe. Yeah.
Now this part is just so cute, because if my wife doesn't watch any of this kind of stuff. My wife does not watch my videos, but if my wife saw this, she would be melting at this point. She goes, "Oh, they were high school sweethearts," or I don't know when they met, but here again, I'm very much with them because I'm about their age, and I remember the times we grew up in the same times, and we were politically aligned then, in terms of the religious ideals of my parents and how I was raised.
Communism and where we are with respect to this new trajectory, and I cannot help. There's a part of me that hears it the way I would have heard it at 18. Right? And to hear
and share. I mean, I think I know. I knew you at 18.
Yeah.
How would you have heard it at 18?
See, they're really cute.
I would have heard it as a lot of breathless, fearful, overhyping of concerns that were really very
Red Scare.
remote, right? And I think the thing is now I'm beginning to understand. I do think that what we heard.
Okay, conservatives, just don't gloat too much, all right? Please be gentle with us. We're therapeutics.
Earlier in our lives was very overblown. And of course, a tremendous amount of harm was done fighting communism in the U.S., right? People who weren't communists, or people who were sort of nominally interested in communism but hadn't done anything wrong, were obviously punished.
Long before Bret and I were born.
Formally and informally. But that said, I now think I appreciate something about why communism causes people to lose their minds, especially people who've seen what it does, right? And so we have heard many people say that, communism always ends in starvation and gulags, and I've begun to wonder if, in fact, it starts with them rather than ends with them, and if the reason isn't pretty obvious from our own discipline.
Okay, so let me just interject one thing here that happens to be in my notes here that totalitarians exert a tremendous amount of effort to control the common narrative, and a point to which we have
Which again, the queen, the symbols, the statues, that's how you control the narrative.
spoken before and will speak a lot again, that we need strong, true, amazing narratives that we can point to, that can become our myths, upon which with which we can build
And where are we going to find these?
an excellent world that is fair for all. But Milan Kundera specifically has spoken to the danger of forgetting one's past, which I think is a big part of what we're experiencing here. Is that almost no one knows history. No one, including in our generation, really was taught history well. And Dreer, paraphrasing Kundera, says nobody defends gulags today, but the world remains full of suckers for the false utopian promises that bring gulags into existence.
Right, and people are erasing. It's not even just forgetting, right? So Kundera deals very well with the issue of forgetting and actually erasing. There's a vivid image that has a member who has behaved badly physically erased from a painting, I believe, or painted over.
Yeah.
But in any case, there are a number of important things. One, I believe that it is simply the failure of group selection that forces totalitarians, especially of a communist ilk, to engage in this totalitarian overreach. In other words, to the extent
And I have no idea what he's saying here.
that people have any freedom at all, communism is not game theoretically stable. Therefore, the way you would stabilize it or attempt to stabilize it has to do with penalizing people who act on the basis of reasonable incentives, right? You have to reschedule their incentives so that they behave, for the same reason that a prisoner or a slave behaves, because the punishment for not behaving is so great.
Yeah. Yep.
So anyway, that hazard is very large. Now, I want to return to something else that you said, though. You were talking about whether people need to believe something larger. And I've heard a number of people talk about this. Maybe most recently, Douglas Murray, who is, I believe, a non-believer, but who regards religion as essential because of effectively what happens when people don't have something larger than themselves to believe in. And so if this is all right, what you've said and what Douglas has said is correct, but if it is also correct that people like you and I get along without a belief in a supernatural higher order, right? That there is something that we have supplanted. Then
Now, go back to Jordan Peterson's talk with Susan Blackmore and just the slow, okay, you're getting along okay. Well, your parents got along okay. How many generations can get along okay? Because you don't have hardly any track record of this.
and this raises the question of, is there, so I have the sense that basically you remove the belief in a higher power, right? And it takes the safety off the gun, but it doesn't fire the gun, right? So the gun becomes dangerous at the point that you don't have that higher order. You can fall into one of these false ideologies and you can end up doing horrible things because it basically slots in where, a belief in something larger would go. But it doesn't have to be that way. So
How do you know? And again, Bret is so interesting because he says this like, wow, that's really very interesting. You would almost think, and I'm sort of sitting here listening to him, thinking about Alistair McGrath listened to him, and my guess is I've listened to a lot more Bret than Alistair has, and he says these things, and it's like you're almost there, Bret. You're almost there, and then you just run back a second.
I'm wondering if we might actually just tell the story of dining with a Malagasy family in southern Madagascar, a judge.
This is a fascinating story, but it's a little long, so I'm going to zip through some of it and get to the end of it because,
And her family, many years ago, would have been 1993, our first trip to Madagascar. You know the story.
Oh,
that I'm-
sure, of course.
Yeah. Do you want to tell it, or shall I?
Sure. This is always a danger when the story is that old. How much will we agree on exactly what happened? But
Okay, let me just set up that we had been traveling across the southern half of Madagascar in my rendering in the book that I wrote about my
it's about
primary
6
research.
years that we were
It
traveling.
was 6 years, yes. It was we traveled 670 kilometers, if memory serves, and it took 67 hours to travel. So we were going at a rocking speed of about 10 kilometers an hour, which is about 6 miles an hour for
Now, wait a
just
minute.
endless.
In the back of a truck that had hard wooden benches that had been built into the back of this truck. This is a common mode of transportation in Madagascar.
Taxi, Bruce?
So we were all night and all day, and the particular vehicle had a light bulb suspended from the roof by a wire that swung back and forth all night that they wouldn't even turn off while you were trying to sleep.
And one tape of Malagasy pop music on loop, one song
over and over again.
and over again.
Travel in the developing world.
And there were people
I
getting
still know
sick.
the
There were
song.
chickens that would land on your shoulder. There was breakdowns. It was endless.
It was
But we
endless.
befriended a young Malagasy boy, really, who was very unlike anyone in rural Madagascar to travel that far. Who was going, I think, from his secondary school back home for a break.
Yep.
We befriended him, and at the point that we stopped,
I don't know if we befriended him or he took pity on us.
it may have been that.
Yeah.
But at the very last stop before we were there, and we just hit a paved road, and it was like 30 more kilometers. They're like, we're here, we're not going anywhere for the night. And I think I may have burst into tears, which isn't like me.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Anyway, by the time we ultimately got to our final destination, he had long since said, please, when we do get there, if we do get there, please come dine with my family and me. And so
We stayed with them.
no, that was in the penultimate night at the judge's house in what would have been Fort Dauphin. I can't remember. Or if it's that the one at the northern. I
No,
can't
it's
remember.
Diego Suarez. It's Fort Dauphin. It's southern.
Okay. We gotten cleaned up. We'd gone over to this nice dinner, and it was a female judge in Madagascar, and her husband I think was a general contractor. And this Madagascar is often ranked as the least prosperous country on the planet, like the lowest GDP, all of this, and they had a solidly middle class life going, and we were having a very nice meal. I spoke some French, which is the main language that people in the middle class in Madagascar speak, although Malagasy is the main language, and they spoke a little bit of English as well. And then during the meal,
we were talking, and they were curious about us, of course. I assume nobody in that family had been off island.
yeah, I don't think so.
Not sure of that, but I think so. In any case, they were curious about us, and they were, as is so often the case, they were so welcoming and generous and decent, and they asked us about our...
And that welcoming and decent is this is part of, well, traditions of hospitality. Where do these traditions come from? Well, of course, if you read the Old Testament, if you read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, if you read the at the end of the book of Judges, Gibeah, I mean, these are hospitality is next to godliness, basically, in these cultures.
religious beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And we, maybe without quite enough caution, coughed up that we didn't really have a religious belief, that we had,
Religion-S.
historical backgrounds that traced their roots to these traditions, but didn't believe anything ourselves. And there was this kind of inability to know what to do with what had just been said, and there was
They became worried about us.
well, I don't think they did, but they voiced
They probably did.
concern about, well, okay, if we take you at your word and you really don't believe anything, then what prevents you from doing X, Y, Z?
How
murder?
It's Jordan Peterson's question.
How is it that you live good lives? How is it that you will continue to live good lives?
Right, which turns out to be a better question than you would think.
That's a terrific question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the answer is something, I think the answer, in our case at least, if we can use our own minds as a place that we have some access, I believe what we've done is we have figured out what higher purpose could be constructed from a secular foundation.
Have you built up or have you just scaffolded down? Because I would argue that you took all the things from up here and just scaffolded down. You did not build it from a secular position. You borrowed from the religious tradition. That's my argument.
In other words, I don't think most people can handle the existentialism of a lack of higher external purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But for those who can get through that part, in one way or another, there are things that you can pursue as if they are ultimate, and they may not be. But it doesn't
And that's sort of an inversion of Peterson's argument that they scaffolded down.
have to drive you crazy.
Yeah.
But that said, I guess the real question is there I shudder every time somebody makes the claim that we have to have religion or else people go crazy and do terrible things.
Did he shudder when he was on stage with Jordan Peterson? Because Jordan's pretty persistent in that argument.
Because if that's true,
and its argument is that, well, you might not, but you're setting up a cultural legacy where that will come.
Then we're stuck in a very bad bind, which is...
And who is we? I think he means humanity.
That we are not getting any less capable of understanding what the universe is made of, which means that the necessity of God to the explanation of what we are and how we got here and what it means is...
And I think that is only the beginning of the way God functions. And because that is sort of the trail of deconstruction from the 19th century, that's the portion that we look at. But I think the argument is it's not the question of where the matter comes from. It's the question of all of the other stuff and what you mean by God.
Ever more remote. So here means that the necessity of God to the explanation of what we are and how we got here and what it means is ever more remote. So are we just going to continue to go crazy till we destroy ourselves, or can people actually get over the existential crisis and...
That's an interesting argument, because he says basically he's acting as if this is all conscious in people, and I think most of the evidence says it isn't, that we sort of scaffold down and sort of neglect and forget God until we find his absence, and then try to fill it in with other things. In other words, he's acting as if this is all a very rational process, and I would argue it very much isn't.
And come up with things that work as well or better.
Well, and so in
work as well as better in what? I mean, again, I just find this whole passage of this conversation so fascinating.
In Dreer's book, I don't think that there's really an invocation of God per se. There is certainly invocation of faith and belief.
Now, again, of God per se, what does she mean by that? Well, there's no invocating the God or the super thing to act on our behalf.
But mostly it is a way of organizing your life in line with principles that have been honorable and served truth and justice and beauty in the past.
And that's pretty much humanism right there. So God is inessential to this. We can take the entire framework that we have received from religion, and we can maintain these principles as such. Okay, what is going to maintain those principles? Won't it be and this is basically Tom Holland and Douglas Murray's anxiety, them being in the UK, that these principles are maintained. They're actually built upon the symbolism. They're built upon the institutions. They're built upon the ritual. And again, just earlier, Bret was talking about the ritual. And, well, now we're just going to hold the ideas as such. And basically, Jordan Peterson's argument is, not for very long, you're not.
And we see no reason to think that they have stopped doing so. If you
well, and except that that's exactly what is happening.
And your family and the community with whom you choose to interact are all also abiding by similar principles.
And now again, if you go back to the video that I made about morality, and then the one about, the long one before it, where do these principles come from? How are they formed? And again, the idea is that I see this all the time, and churches tried this in the 1950s, and churches continue to try this, even some very conservative churches. We're not going to teach the kids the Bible stories because, there's stuff in the Bible stories that the kids love, but we don't like. I mean, all the blood and all the stuff that brought Tom Holland to get excited about the Romans and the Greeks. Got some of that in the Bible stories, but nice humanist mothers who don't let their kids play with guns and get terribly disappointed that little boys are doing this. They're, well, let's not teach them the Bible stories. Let's just teach them to be honest. And what I've seen is that simply doesn't work. And you go all the way back to Jordan Peterson's psychology, that you see it acted out. You see it played out. It's a narrative there first, and then we sort of take from the narrative and distill the principles. But the narrative and the story and the examples, that's the living stuff. And all of this other stuff is derivative. And so what we've been doing is getting rid of this symbolism and the stories and the narratives and expecting the scaffolding. It's if you go down to Mono Lake, which is just over the Sierra, where basically there's a high mineral content in the water and these tufa structures, and then they take all the water before it gets to the lake and exposes these structures. But the idea is almost that, well, we'll just keep the structures, and you should say, no, it's actually what's in the water that makes the structures. And you imagine if you can just get rid of the water, then the structures will stand on their own. And the truth is, the structures get extremely fragile. And so when you visit Mono Lake, you can't touch the structures because they just simply crumble. Because, it's almost as if you're making rock candy and not realizing that it's the water that is charged with sugar that's going to create the crystalline structure. And you're not going to get the structures without the water that has this charged. And that's why generation after generation after generation, these things decay.
And so it is not primarily about is there God? It is about all of the other traditions that the religion is based on.
Right.
They have it exactly backwards.
So if I can go back to the what I think is a fair characterization of at least the Jewish diaspora, and actually I would think most of Israeli society too, there is something that occurs where religion is practiced and nobody is all that interested in getting you to unpack your level of belief, right? The point is, do you behave? Actually, it matches very well what I heard Jordan Peterson once say, which got him in lots of trouble in certain quarters. I think it was actually during the debates in Vancouver, where he was asked if he believed in a supernatural God, and he said, I behave as if I do.
Right.
Which made perfect sense to me, what he was saying, but was taken by some to indicate a kind of hypocrisy or vagueness or something.
How about the other person on the stage?
Like that. But I guess the question is, if it was true that Jews were anti-fragile because of all the stuff that happens every time the center collapses, and that one of the things that you do is you teach people.
And isn't it true that not just the Jews, but when the center collapses, just about everybody gets more religious?
How not to shed their traditions because those traditions are serving unstated goals. One of the things you might do is provide a kind of don't ask, don't tell over faith. And it's keep your faith private in the public sphere. Don't have it be there. Again, they're desperately trying. Again, they remind me of 19th and early 20th century Christians in the modernist fundamentalist fight, where we've got so much sunk cost in modernism. Let's keep it going. And it's not going to work. You're going to have to go back to the essence. That does seem to be the nature of it, right? People have complex relationships, and it's very hard to know exactly what they believe, nor does it matter.
Yeah.
Nor does it matter?
That's right.
That's pure modern. That's again, that's exactly where we're at. Now, a little bit later, we'll have to see if I come back to this because they make a lot of really interesting they talk about the family. And again, I think their points are dead on with respect to the family, but why? And yeah, so anyway, at least for this part of the talk, really, really interesting. I don't know that I'm going to post this, but if you see it, I posted it. If you don't see it, I didn't.